Sterling First United Methodist Church. This is our final video in our summer series on the book of James, the letter of James, which I've given sort of as a tagline, the wisdom of wholeness. I think that captures well what James is all about. And so we wrap it up today with this video. Just as a reminder where we've been this summer, throughout the months of June and July, we've hit a lot of different topics, the topics of James itself, but also some background issues. And for this final week, as we come now into August, we'll be talking about the passage of 5:12 through 20. And I think that's mostly focused on prayer. And so that would be our main kind of content section. But the background issue that I've saved for the end is James and Jesus, partly because I think something from James 5:12 illustrates the connection between James and Jesus. So I've delayed it till now, but we'll be talking about how distinctively Christian or not this letter is. Because in many ways it's less focused on Jesus, overtly at least, than almost all of the New Testament. So we'll talk about what makes James Christian and how is James influenced by Jesus. So that's what we'll be doing as our background issue for this week. But to recap last week, first of all, we did the first half of James 5 last week, talked about James 5, 1 through 11, and it seems to be specifically the rich landowners within its original context. This would have been the top 3% or so of the Roman Empire. And it seems to condemn them for two reasons. First of all, they were defrauding the poor, who were the poor day laborers who were working on the farm, either by simply keeping money that they had promised to pay, or by delaying payment to those they had promised to pay, still paying them, but just waiting to pay them. And in that culture at that time, a day laborer would usually get paid at the end of the day for the work done that day. There weren't nice contracts and bank settlements that could just kind of have direct transfer every 2 weeks or something like that. And so if you didn't get paid that day, you would be worried you wouldn't get paid at all. But also, most people didn't have really almost any economic security. You very often had very little limited savings, and so if you weren't paid on a single day, you might not have food that evening. And so James condemns the rich who have all this money from doing such mean and miserly things with their wealth towards the day laborers. And I applied that to modern America as I prayerfully thought about how does this impact us. I think most in America would probably fall into the class of the rich. And so I think James in our day would say a few things. First of all, we have to be just with our wealth. We certainly obviously should not gain wealth in ways that are either illegal or just generally unjust and exploitative. But also we should be generous, even beyond just what is simply legal and just, but let's go out of our way, those who are wealthy, to give back in ways that are helpful. And finally, I do think James also indicates, and this is the second part of the statement here, he seems to be against hoarding and thinking that whether or not they're exploiting the poor directly, James seems to think it's a problem for those who are very wealthy to have this decadent amount of things and luxurious lifestyles when others are going hungry and don't have enough. And simply the imbalance of wealth itself seems to concern James. And so I would apply that to our day in saying, even if we have much wealth, we should live in simplicity as much as possible. Don't like making exact standards of what this looks like, but I think we should always ask ourselves, do I really need this? Not only can I afford it. It's very easy to say, can I afford this? And then yes, and get whatever you want because it excites you at the moment. But asking at least more often, do I need this? Do I need a bigger TV? Do I need a bigger house? Do I need a nicer car? All those sorts of things, I think, is something that Christians should be asking themselves. We can maybe sometimes indulge, but I think we should have a habit of trying to do more with less and be content with living below our means and then giving back generously with the extra that we have. So that's my understanding of how James would apply. The teaching about the rich in verses 1 through 6 would apply to today. The second half of that, I think, is in the ancient context of James, really the focus, though, because there don't seem to have been any of those very wealthy people within James's congregation. And so I actually think most of James 1 through 11, the second half of that is actually the main focus for James. And that's where he encourages those who are exploited, the poor day laborers, to persevere. And he gives them examples of perseverance, like the prophets and Job, a farmer waiting for rain. And in all of those cases, the focus is on the fact that, yes, there's difficulty now, but God sees the injustice that's done, and God will come to bring justice to the earth. And so there's this reminder that God is watching, and God will eventually set everything to right. And so hang on, persevere, continue. That perseverance doesn't mean you never say anything and you don't bewail or lament the tough times you're going through or anything like that. It doesn't mean you can't protest the injustices that are done, but it just means you hang on and you wait for God's justice to come. And so I think the second half of James 5 through 11 is really the focus for James. But for many of us in America, if we fall within the wealthy, then maybe the first half is more of a message to us, at least. So that was the content section of James last week. We also talked about a couple of background issues last week. And the first is, who is this written to? And it clearly, from the very first verse, is written to diaspora Jews, meaning Jews living outside of the land of Israel. And it seems to be literal Jews, not metaphorically all Christians are in a sense new Israel. That does not seem to be the case for James. It seems to literally think of those who are ethnically Jewish as those receiving the letter. And the fact that in 2:1 it talks about believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ would seem to make them specifically Christian Jews. So the letter seems to be addressed to those who are ethnically Jewish, living outside of the land of Israel, and are Christian, but is addressed sort of to that group in general. No one specific congregation or church, but lots of them across the ancient Roman world. The other issue we talked about is, where is James written from? Some people think Rome, and there's some reasons for thinking that, but I believe it's probably written from the eastern Mediterranean coast, which would indicate two cities in particular as the prime candidates. Antioch in modern-day Syria was a big city, and there was a known big Jewish and Christian population there. But even more likely, and this is where my position would be, is that it's written from Jerusalem. That's where James the Just seems to have lived until his death in 62, and that's who we think is the most likely author. And it would also just be the most natural place, the capital of all Jews in Jerusalem, to write a letter to all of those living outside of the land of Israel. So I think Jerusalem is the most likely location, probably. So that's what we talked about last week. Coming to this week, the background issue we'll talk about is James and Jesus. How do these two figures relate? And that, since we've said that James, the just brother of Jesus, is the most likely author, you would, obviously we kind of think, well, obviously they relate a lot. They're brothers, if that understanding of the author of James is correct. But when you read the letter, you realize there's really actually not much about Jesus in it directly. And so why is there so little said about Jesus? A quick tour of what's said about Jesus. Well, actually, I'll come back to that. That's right. This is important for a number of reasons. First of all, there's a historical interest to it. First of all, this is not so much said today, but back several generations, it was often thought that this was actually a Jewish letter, not Christian originally, and some Christians came along and inserted Jesus' name at a couple of junctures, and otherwise it was fundamentally a Jewish writing that Christians just sort of took over and inserted Jesus in a couple of times. That's not very often suggested today, but there have been people who have thought that in the past. There are also people, and this is one that I know of, some scholars who believe this today, that it's actually specifically downplaying its Christianity to try to build rapport with non-Christian Jews as another possible understanding of it. And so it, you could think of a Christian in modern-day America who's proclaiming Christian messages about freedom and love and everything, but to some degree downplaying Christianity so that they can build common American identity with atheists and agnostics and Muslims and Jews and, various different religions and everything. And there might be a time for that as a Christian to kind of share that continuity and talk about all the points of continuity that we have. There have been some who have suggested this with James as well, that it's intentionally minimal statements about Jesus for that reason. The other thing that it might be of historical interest to know this is if this is, if we said that James the Just, brother of Jesus, is the most likely person to have written this letter, does that actually make it less likely that it's by James if he doesn't mention Jesus much at all? Why not say, as my brother used to say, that sort of thing at some juncture. So some have thought that this makes it less likely that it's actually written by James. There's also, I think, a theological point here as well. In a book that's in our New Testament, that's, we think of the New Testament as very Jesus-focused, and for the most part, the New Testament is very much Jesus-focused. Why would there be so little distinct Christianity in this writing if so much of it could be shared by other Jews and, in fact, just other Hellenistic people in the Roman Empire? So I think there's kind of a theological reason to investigate this as well. So let's talk about what is the connection between James and Jesus then. Jesus is only named twice in the letter. At 1:1, James addresses himself or begins saying he is a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he is identifying himself from the start as a follower of Jesus Christ as his Lord. And then in 2:1, he says, my brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ must not show favoritism. So the two locations, both of them address Jesus as Lord, the second one also as Christ or Messiah. But there's really not much built there. We're not learning much about Jesus. We just know that this person is identifying as a follower of Jesus. And that's about it. It is possible, but unlikely, that in 5:6, when it talks about the rich landowners bringing to court and then killing the righteous one, that could indicate the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. But more likely, it's just kind of an example of what's happening to innocent people are being killed by the landowners. There's nothing else around 5:6 that indicates it's about Jesus or the crucifixion. So it's possible, but I think unlikely that that is a reference to Jesus. The final place where Jesus might show up is there are quite a few references to Lord throughout the book of James, and Lord can mean various different things. Not only in the book of James, but in the New Testament in general. Lord will sometimes mean God, which we might think of as the Trinity or God the Father specifically as Christians. This is the case in a number of instances in James. There's kind of a parallel statement somewhere around it that it clearly indicates that Lord is a synonym of God. At a couple of places, it is clearly Jesus, the ones that we just talked about in 1:1 and 2:1. Both of them address Jesus as Lord. And so we have a few other references to Lord in James that could conceivably be Jesus. But obviously, the ones we can measure where it's clearly either God or clearly either Jesus, there's a lot more where it's clearly God. And so it's more likely that those unclear references are also references to God rather than Jesus. But for example, in 5, 7, and 8, it talks about the return of the Lord. That would fit Jesus' second coming. That's the way the New Testament often talks about it. So, there's some reason to think some of those might be about Jesus' return or something, but it's still certainly not definitive. So the only things that we can kind of hang our hat on in terms of specific statements about Jesus boil down to 1:1 and 2:1, and Jesus being Lord. So at first pass, it seems that the only connection between James and Jesus in this letter is that Jesus is the Lord of the author and the audience, and that's about all we can say for sure. Which would seem to make this a sort of just barely Christian writing with very little about Jesus in it. However, I think statements about Jesus are not the best way to measure this, actually, because I think there's a lot of indirect influence of Jesus on the letter of James in ways that go beyond simply naming Jesus. And this comes more than anything else through the teachings of James and comparing that to the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels. There are a number of statements throughout James that just seem to sound like Jesus, either in terms of the themes or ideas or images used. There's lots of partial parallels you could come to. But really the closest ones all come from the Sermon on the Mount, a collection of teaching from Matthew 5 through 7 that also has some parallels in the book of Luke as well. And so all of those we can find. In most cases, however, they're not really direct. It's just kind of like you can kind of gather ideas from Jesus, gather ideas from James, and see some clear parallels, but the wording is rarely very close. So let me give you some of the examples of things that are actually a little bit closer, but still are not, for the most part, very direct. So one parallel we can find is in Matthew 5, 3 through 9 is the Beatitudes. And I've selected sort of the Beatitudes that are closest for James. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. All of these ideas, but not collected together in the same way, appear in James. So James 2:5 also talks about the poor inheriting the kingdom that was promised to them. So we remember, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom. Right? There's a promise of the kingdom for those who are poor in spirit. Luke's version of the statement, in fact, just simply says the poor, so it's even closer to James in that way. But you hear, the poor promised the kingdom, both in Matthew as well as Luke, for that matter, and then James 2:5. And the next beatitude that I have from Matthew 5:7, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. You see sort of the reverse of that stated in James 2:13. Judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. So Jesus promises that those who are merciful will be shown mercy, and James says that judgment will be unmerciful to those who have been unmerciful. So you can see sort of the reverse of that beatitude. Matthew 5:8 talks about blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. You compare that to James 4:8, and it says, come near to God, and he will come near to you. Not exactly the same as seeing God, but similar. And then James instructs them to wash their hands and purify their hearts. So, pure in heart, purify your heart. Similar idea. And then finally, Matthew 5:9 says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. And James 3:18 says, peacemakers who sow in peace will raise a harvest of righteousness. None of these are direct parallels, but you can see just the influence of ideas in the Sermon on the Mount and James in something like this. We also see it in Matthew 7:1, another part of the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. And you look at a collection of things from James 4 and 5:9, and you see a similar idea. James tells them not to slander, but then lines up or equates slander with judging and tells them not to judge their neighbor. So there's that kind of in James 4:11 and 12. It doesn't say it exactly the same way, but there's clearly the implication, do not judge, is the same as do not slander. So there's a command not to judge. And then in James 5:9, after saying they shouldn't grumble against their brothers, there's the promise that you would be judged if you grumble. So again, there's nothing directly parallel here, but you can see a general influence in these passages. A little bit closer comes in Matthew 7:7. Jesus in Matthew 7:7 says, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. James expands that in 2:5, but you actually get the same basic phrasing. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God. Obviously in Matthew, the asking is of God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. So you do have the same phrasing, ask and it will be given to you, but James intersplices some other words in between. But closest of all comes then in our passage for this week. In Matthew 5:34-37, Jesus instructs, but I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. You compare that to James 5:12, and we can see here this is the closest we get to really clear verbal similarities. Even here there's some differences, but it's unmistakable that there is a pattern here between the two. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven, or by earth, or by anything else. You hear the same do not swear, which was not a common teaching in Jewish circles. Swearing is not off limits in the Old Testament. You have to be careful about what you swear, but it's not off limits. And very few Jewish writings tell you not to swear at all. So this absolute prohibition against swearing. By the way, this is not using cuss words or bad words when we're talking about swearing. We're talking about swearing an oath to do something by, say, the temple or by God or something like that. Anyway, there's this prohibition not to do that at all, and a threefold reason, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. In Matthew's version, the last thing ends with Jerusalem, and James has or by anything else. But, you hear that same sort of threefold pattern, and then they both end with a very similar phrasing in Greek that's even closer here in the NIV translation that I have. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. more literally, it's let your yes be yes and your no be no, or let your yes say yes, yes, or no, no. But clearly there's some connection here between Matthew 5:34 through 37 and James 5:12. So there's definitely Jesus' influence of his teaching on the book of James, but this raises its own question. Why not name Jesus as the source of this teaching? Why didn't James just say, as my brother used to say, we're all Christians here, so remember what Jesus has taught? Why not go out and name Jesus? And there have been a number of reasons suggested for that. The solution I like best is that by its very nature, wisdom literature, so you think about the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, to some degree the book of Ecclesiastes or Job as well, but also just proverbial literature that is found, collections that are found almost any culture has. And they don't cite sources usually. I mean, usually proverbial literature just kind of is a collection of wisdom from that society and everything. And so wisdom literature by its nature usually absorbs traditional teaching from various sources and then expresses it anew. And I think that makes the most sense of why James doesn't quote Jesus and why it's very rarely directly the same phrasing as Jesus. Instead, what you sense from James is somebody who's absorbed his brother's teaching, who has also absorbed teachings from the Old Testament and other sources, and who has meditated, made those teaching his own, and then in writing this letter has sort of re-expressed it in new ways, fundamentally influenced by Jesus without naming Jesus as the source and without directly quoting Jesus. So that to me at least makes the most sense of how Jesus presents such an influence on the book of James and yet is so rarely mentioned. So in summary, James and Jesus are very close, even if it might not look like it at first pass. So let's actually get into the content of James 5:12 through 20, the ending of the book of James, and we see a few things. Verses 12 through 18 are really the final instructions, and they're mostly on prayer. So verse 12 itself, the one that we were just talking about, it's commending simple, truthful speech. You shouldn't have to swear. Whether it really means you can never swear at all, swear any oaths might not be the point, but the point is instead, you shouldn't have to swear. When you say yes to something, you should do that yes. Whatever you agree to do, you should do it. And if you say no to something, you should really mean that no, so that you're somebody who's trustworthy and your simple, plain speech is acceptable and known and reliable, I guess is really the point. In verses 13 through 16, we see a number of things that are commended, but again, prayer is the main one. So we hear about, somebody is either sick or needing to confess sins, that person should pray in need of healing as well. It does mention briefly in verse 13, if you're happy, you sing songs of praise. So it's kind of like a happy prayer in a sense. And it talks about the two needs that seem to be predominant here are prayers for healing. So it talks about inviting the elders of the church over to pray over you and anoint you with oil. My understanding is this is the scriptural reference from which Catholic doctrine draws the belief in last rites, that you come and anoint somebody with oil just shortly before they're to die. I think in this passage, the idea is actually hopefully restoring the person to health instead. But it also talks about prayers for forgiveness and the practice of confessing sins to each other as a good thing that Christians should do for their sort of moral future and moral integrity. So I think prayer is the overall main idea, but there are a variety of aspects to prayer highlighted in this section. And then verses 17 and 18 is giving us a great example of prayer in faith, and that is of Elijah, who prayed, and it did not rain, and then prayed again, and 3.5 years later, it rained on the earth. This is a narrative from back in 1 Kings 17, 18, somewhere around there, if my memory serves correctly. And so a great example of faith from the Old Testament and effective prayer. I mean, can you imagine praying and no rain coming for 3.5 years? That's an effective prayer. And so James wants to encourage his audience that prayer really is effective, and we should put a lot of stock in prayer and the power of prayer, which is something that I think we all need to remember. I certainly do. And then in verses 19 and 20, what we get is maybe just a continuation of this last section, but it probably is the letter closing. It's the last two verses. And one commentator talks about it as the noble task of mutual correction, which I think is a great way to put it. In our day, we very much think of, we're very worried about being seen as hypocrites or as being judgmental and all those sorts of things. And so we kind of let everybody do their own thing and just kind of hope that that works out if we all just kind of like look out for ourselves morally. And James, that's not at all James's view. It's not at all the ancient view. They assumed in the ancient world, and James commends here, that we need to correct each other, that we need to be on the lookout for each other's mistakes, not in a mean, judgmental sort of way, but for the mutual edification, improvement of our lives. And so James really commends that, there's a lot of power to correcting somebody who's going astray. You can save them from death and turn them away from a multitude of future errors, is probably the idea there. And I would add further that there's a good chance that this is the whole point of the letter of James, and that's why I think that this is probably the letter closing and not just an aspect of final instructions, but really sums up the whole letter. I think this is what the letter of James is meant to do. It's meant to keep us from a multitude of errors, save our souls from death, and put us back on the right path. And so that's how James ends, is with these last two verses in that way. So a couple of takeaways and questions that we'll consider this coming Sunday when we meet together for our final time. First of all, I would say that James is deeply Christian, even if it is not obviously so. You read the letter, and there's just so much that anyone from almost any background can appreciate and enjoy and learn from, no matter whether you're a Christian or not. And yet at the same time, even if Jesus isn't mentioned a lot, Jesus' influence is very deep through Jesus' teaching in the Synoptic Gospels and elsewhere. Matthew, Mark, and Luke in particular are the Synoptic Gospels. So we see a special connection between those Gospels and James, and Jesus' teaching in them, and James's teaching in this letter, even if it's mostly indirect. My other takeaway would be that we need to support each other in prayer. That's the main idea of this section. But also I'd say in song, when things are good, let's sing together and rejoice together. One that I think happens very rarely at churches, or two really, is confession and correction. But I think those are very necessary. I think it's idealistic and frankly just incorrect to think that as individuals we're going to do a great job of changing ourselves on our own. We need to be in practice of confessing our sins to each other and also giving and receiving correction in ways that are loving and build each other up. And so I think those are things from the ancient world that we could very much apply to our own world today. But we have to be careful because our own world doesn't expect that. And so we have to kind of do it start doing it in a cautious way. Otherwise, we'll just freak people out. But I think there's something here that we should learn from. A couple of questions we'll consider on Sunday. The first one is broad. What have you learned from James this summer? I'd love to hear things that you've thought about or heard or learned as we've discussed this wonderful book together this summer. And second of all, what prayer or more generally support do you need from the church? All of 5:12 through 20, I think, is not addressed really specifically to individuals, but within a church context, within a community context. So prayer is the main idea, but there's other forms of support, singing together, correcting each other, prayers for healing, confession, all those sorts of things. So the support might be in another form, but it also could just be in prayer. So we'll also think about that this coming week as well. It's been a great summer. Thank you for all of you who have watched these videos and participated on Sunday morning. I hope that you've benefited from it, but I've certainly enjoyed leading this class on James, and I love this book, and I hope you've come to love the book of James as well.